Hello everyone. In the previous video, we have seen how to create a pod using the manifest file as well as the imperative commands. In this video, we will see how we can create a Kubernetes service called NodePort and how we can access the applications deployed in the Kubernetes service. In Kubernetes, we have three types of Kubernetes services. One is the cluster IP, and the second one is NodePort, and the third one is load balancer. So the cluster IP, if you want to access the applications within the Kubernetes cluster, then you can go with the cluster IP. And if you want to access the applications or the workloads outside of the Kubernetes cluster, then you can use NodePort. And the similar way, if you want to access the applications from outside of the Kubernetes cluster, then you can use the load balancer. So the first one is to access the applications within the Kubernetes cluster, and the other two services are to access the workloads or the applications from outside of the Kubernetes cluster, let's say from the internet or from the browser or the postman, etc. So in this video, we'll see more on the NodePort service, and in the next video, we'll deep dive onto the load balancer Kubernetes service. So let's get started. And this is the NodePort service that we are talking about. If you deploy any application, for example, let's say Nginx application or the Python application or the MongoDB application or the Postgres, MySQL, any applications that you deploy in Kubernetes, and if you want to access that application from the internet, right? So let's say from the browser, then you can use this NodePort service and access the applications. So let's see how we can use this NodePort service in detail. So here you can see we have two nodes. This is the node 1 and this is the node 2 in our Kubernetes cluster. So let's assume this is the two node Kubernetes cluster. And for each node, you can see a public IP attached to these nodes, right? And the brown boxes that you see here at the bottom, so let's assume these are the pods. This is the Nginx pod, this is the Python pod, or this is the MongoDB pod. So these are the three different pods that are running in our Kubernetes cluster, and those are scheduled in these two nodes. And let's say if you want to access this Nginx pod from the internet, right? So from the browser. So what you can do, you can create a node port on top of these pods, and using the NodePort service, you can access the application. So let's say you create this Nginx pod and you attach labels. For example, here you can see the label that we have attached for this Nginx pod is app colon Nginx hyphen app. So this is the label that you have attached for this pod. And if you want to create a node port for these pods, you have to use the same labels under the selector field, right? So here, let's assume this is the node port that we have created, and here you can see app colon Nginx iPhone service. So in your node port manifest file, you have to use the same label as of the pod under the selector section, so that there will be a link established between the node port service as well as the Nginx pod. And once you create the NodePort service, there will be a cluster IP that would be created by default. And apart from that, there will be a port that would be exposed on both the nodes, right? If you don't specify any port, node port, while creating your NodePort service in your manifest file, so by default, a port would be selected from this range, that is 30,000 to 32,767. So there will be a port that would be automatically assigned to each of these nodes, right? So let's say when you create your NodePort service, so there is a port 30,007 that is automatically opened or exposed on both these nodes. So once this is exposed, then you can use the public IP address of the node, right? So here you can see the public IP address colon the node port. So the node port that we got is 30,007. So using the public IP address of the node and the port, you can access the application running inside the Kubernetes nodes. And one more thing that I want to clarify here is since the application running in one of the node, let's say this Nginx pod is running in node 1. So do not think that we can access this Nginx pod only using the public IP of the node 1. You can access this Nginx pod using the node 2 public IP as well. So internally, Kubernetes will route the traffic to these appropriate node port services and from there to the pods. So you can use any of the public IP of the Kubernetes nodes, and then you can use the appropriate port so that the traffic will be routed to the respective pods that we deploy. So let's see this in action, and so that you get more clarity on what we are talking about. So let's proceed with the demo part. So I have logged in to the Azure Kubernetes Services, and I'm using the same Kubernetes cluster that I have used in the previous video as well for creating the namespaces and the pods. So let me see the files that we have in the current directory. So you can see the pod.yaml. So let me open the pod.yaml manifest file. So this is the YAML file that we have used for creating the pod in the previous video. So let me open the NodePort.yaml as well. So this I have created just before making this video. So let me open this file and show you the content that we have in this YAML manifest file. So here, this is the manifest file for creating the NodePort. Here you can see the API version as V1 and the kind as the service. So whereas for the pod, the kind you can see here as pod. And in the metadata section, you can specify the name of the service. So I just wanted to create the Kubernetes NodePort service. So just I'm giving the name as Nginx NodePort SVC. And in dev-ns namespace, I'm going to create this NodePort service. So this is the same namespace where I have the Nginx pod is also created. So I'm using the same namespace. And here you can see the type as NodePort. That means whenever you apply this YAML file, Kubernetes service of type NodePort will be created. And here you can see the ports. This is the port 80 on which the application is running. And you can see the NodePort that I have mentioned specifically, that is 30,007, right? So you have to keep in mind that you have to provide the port in between 30,000 to 32,767. So one thing that is missing in both this pod and the service manifest file, that is the labels and the selectors. So in Kubernetes, the labels and selectors plays a key role in mapping the Kubernetes service to the Kubernetes pods, right? So here, let me provide a label for the pod. So in the metadata section, I'm providing the labels. So let me give as app colon Nginx hyphen app. So this is the label that I'm providing for the Nginx pod. This can be anything, but make sure whatever the label that you provide in this Nginx pod, the same label that you have to provide in the NodePort service under the selector field as well. So here, if you come down and next to type, click on enter and type selector, and you have to provide the same label that we have mentioned here under the selector field. So that is app colon Nginx hyphen app. Since we mentioned the same label in both the service as well as the pod, so there should be a mapping established, and the traffic will be routed from this service to the underlying pods. So let me save this one, and let me save the pod as well. Let me create the pod using the kubectl apply command, kubectl apply hyphen f pod.yaml. So this will create the pod in the dev-ns namespace. So you can see the pod is created. So let me get all the pods in dev-ns namespace. So you can see one pod is running, and that is 13 seconds ago. So let me create the NodePort service as well. That is kubectl apply hyphen f nodeport.yaml. So this will create a NodePort. So you can see the service NodePort is created. So let me get all the services that are running in the dev-ns namespace. So the command for that is kubectl get svc and the namespace name dev-ns. So here you can see the NodePort service has been created, and here you can see 30,000 is exposed on both the nodes, right? So now using the IP address of the nodes and the NodePort, you can access the Nginx application. So let me go on to the Azure portal. Let me expand this tab and let me go on to the node pool section on the left. If you click on the node pools, we have one node pool as of now, that is the agent pool. So in that agent pool, we have two nodes. Let me go on to this agent pool, and under the nodes, so you can see there are two nodes available as of now, right? So let me go to one of the node here. So let me copy the external IP of the node. So this is the node one external IP address. So let me go on to the new tab and let me paste this one. And if I provide the port as 30,007, so still we are not able to get the response. So this is because we have to open this 30,007 port on the NSG row. So let me go on to the Azure portal again and let me search for network security rules. So here you can see this is the AKS agent pool NSG. So this is the network security group that will be created by default when you create the Azure Kubernetes service. So if you click on this NSG, if you go on to the inbound security rules, so here you can see there is no 30,007 port has been added. So that's the reason we are not getting any incoming request. So let me add a new inbound rule here. So here, let me provide the port of our node port, that is 30,007, and from everywhere we are allowing the inbound traffic, that is on 7. So why we are allowing only 30,007 is because so this is the port that we got when we create a NodePort service. So that's the reason in order to access any applications, we need to add this inbound rule in our energy rules. So let me proceed here. Let me click on add to add this inbound rule. So you can see the inbound rule has been created. So let me go on to the tab again. Let me refresh. So now you can see we are getting the response from the Nginx pod that we have deployed in dev-ns namespace. So here you can see this is the external IP address of the node in our Kubernetes cluster. And this is the node port that we got when we create the node port service. So using the public IP address of the node and the port, we can access the applications that we deploy in our Kubernetes cluster. So let me go on to the node pools again. So let me go on to the Kubernetes services. Let me go on to the AKS cluster. And if I go on to the node pools here, so this is the node pool that we have currently. So let me go on to the nodes. Now let me go on to the other node that we have in our Kubernetes cluster. And let me grab the external IP address of the second node in our Kubernetes cluster and paste that in the new tab. And we have to provide the same node port that we got for our node port service. So here, using the public IP of the second node as well, we can access the application deployed in our Kubernetes cluster. So in this way, using the node port service, so once you create a node port service using the node IP address and the node port, you can access the applications deployed in the Kubernetes cluster. So now let's go on to the Cloud Shell again. So let me show you one more thing very quickly. Let me open the NodePort 1.yaml file here. So here I'm trying to create a new NodePort service with the name Nginx NodePort SVC2. So this is different from the previous NodePort service that we have created. So I'm trying to create in the same namespace, but I'm providing the different selector here. And if I try to give the same node port here, right? So previously we have created a node port by providing 30,007 as a node port. Here as well, like I'm trying to create a new node port service and providing the same node port. So let's try to create this one and see what happens. So let me run kubectl here, apply -f nodeport 1.yaml. So here you can see invalid value 30,007 provided port is already allocated. So that means you cannot use the same node port for creating the multiple node port services. If you want to create a node port service, then you have to provide a different node port in your manifest files. All right. Till now, we have seen what is NodePort service in Kubernetes and how we can use that NodePort service to access the applications deployed in Kubernetes from the internet. So now let's look what are the disadvantages that we get when we use the NodePort services for accessing our applications. So the first disadvantage is since we are using the actual node IP addresses for accessing the applications, so there might be situations that the IP address of the nodes might change. Then you have to change the URL for accessing the applications. So you have to deal with those things. So the other disadvantage is you are actually exposing the IP addresses of the Kubernetes nodes. So let's say, for example, other teams are deployed some applications in the Kubernetes cluster and they want to access the application using the node port. Then you have to provide the IP addresses of the nodes. So this might expose the IP addresses of the nodes that you are using for your Kubernetes clusters. And the other disadvantage is you cannot use a smaller port for accessing your applications. So whenever you use a node port service for accessing your applications, you need to use a default port range from 30,000 to 32,767. So there is no alternative. So you cannot use any 443 or 80 for accessing applications. So you should definitely use any port from this port range. And the last disadvantage is you cannot use the same node port for multiple node port services. Let's say if you are using 31,000 for accessing one of the applications, and if you want to create a node port for other application with the same port, you cannot create. So if you want to create, you have to use the other port, for example, 30,000 or 31,001, 31,002, something like that. You cannot use the same port for creating multiple node port services. In the next video, we'll see how we can use the Kubernetes load balancer service for accessing the workloads from outside of the Kubernetes cluster. And we'll see how that load balancer service will overcome all these disadvantages. Thank you.